You want answers?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You want answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
And you have offended the Shaolin Temple.
You can't handle the truth!
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
Well, you know, we covered in Behind the Headlines today some story of Alabama and these roadside collection points to gather data on impairment and driving. And it's something I've had to be thinking about, you know, quite a bit. I mean, even since before 2012, going back to the 2010 elections with Prop 19 and the exit polls that showed a lot of people that switched their votes to no were afraid of SMOF, stoned mayhem on the freeways. And, of course, the reaction to that in Washington State was to impose a 5 nanogram per se limit. They didn't do so in Colorado, but the political will was there to, after 6 times, finally get a 5 nanogram limit that's a rebuttable inference, presumptive inference sort of law. Montana has added that to their law as well. And we've gone rounds and rounds and rounds about the 5 nanograms and what constitutes impairment, yada, yada, yada. But I want to go back to this PIRE study, the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation study, and some of the data that they brought out of this that I really want to highlight. And that is this one sentence. This is from their survey. This is from the California analysis of data from 2007 and 2010, drug and alcohol dependence, the prevalence of cannabis-involved driving in California. And this is the quote: "Our roadside survey data corroborated the findings of earlier studies that people do not associate cannabis use with an increase in driving risk." And there was another quote further down the page here. Let's see if I can get to this one. Let's see. "The increased availability of cannabis may inadvertently increase its prevalence among drivers and thus elevate the potential risk of vehicle crash. Several studies show that cannabis users do not perceive cannabis use as being associated with increased driving risk, even among those who believe that alcohol elevates crash risk." And they list Danton 2003, McCarthy 2007, Terry and Wright 2004 are the 3 studies. "Lacking public perception that cannabis increase risks of crash, increase in cannabis use by the public should correspond with increases in cannabis use while driving." Okay, well, first of all, cannabis use while driving, quite different than whether or not we're detecting cannabis in people's blood or urine, for that matter. A completely different question. But I want to get to this because this is something we're going to have to fight. And it's been something I've been wrestling with as I figure out how to write these articles. And it's one sticking point. And it's this sticking point that cannabis users themselves do not detect or do not believe there is an increase in risk. Yet many of them believe that alcohol elevates crash risk. And I think when you survey alcohol users, they will tell you that if you get too drunk, it elevates your risk of a crash. And I think if you ask sober people, they would agree with that assessment. So what is it about cannabis use and people not believing it's such a risk with driving? There's 2 possibilities to my mind. One, the use of cannabis somehow muddles our brains and our judgments as to think that we're better drivers than we are. Or 2, there's no increase in risk. We're looking for something that doesn't really exist. And that, I believe, is more likely to be what we're looking at here. I've been a cannabis user for decades now, 2 decades, over 2 decades. I've known hundreds, if not thousands of people who smoke cannabis. My opportunities to travel around the country. I've performed in 17 states, 33 cities, over 75 different performances. And at each one of these, I meet people from all around the country who are cannabis consumers. And I can't think of too many of them that I don't know are people that will drive after using cannabis. And I don't perceive, and have ridden with many of them and never perceived them to be risky drivers or dangerous drivers. If anything, more careful and consistent drivers. The kind of drivers who don't switch lanes or don't get all aggro about being the first to get to the next stoplight or get road rage over someone cutting them off. the kind of people who leave a lot of room behind the car, from the car ahead of them. And we've seen numbers of studies that have shown that cannabis users detect their own impairment and compensate for such. But even to that level, I'd like to address that at a certain level of cannabis use, you do develop a tolerance. And we've got studies that show that as well. People like myself, like Brian, like many of the medical cannabis patients out there, or the very dedicated cannabis aficionados who are lucky enough to be able to access it every day, develop a tolerance. They develop an ability to compensate and to be able to function just like anybody who has a prescription for OxyContin or, did you know, Marinol? Marinol, the Schedule 3 THC that says until you know how this medication may affect you, do not drive or operate heavy machinery. But when you do figure it out, go right ahead, get behind the forklift, pilot the airplane, right? Why can we accept in the society that there are different classes and different types of drugs and different types of people using them? And instead of trying to worry about what's in our systems at any particular time, worry about whether or not we can actually perform the tasks. This reliance on drug testing to determine who's good enough to be an employee, who's good enough to be driving on the roads, who's good enough to be getting unemployment or welfare benefits. Didn't Dr. King say we're going to move away from, being a country that judges people by the color of their skin? We're going to judge them by the content of their character. So why do we judge them by the content of their blood and urine? Let's judge people on their actual attributes. We'll have plenty more to say about this, but we got to go. For Brian the Red, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.